Lieutenant Jack Reaper awoke to the scent of damp earth and the distant hum of alien insects. His head throbbed, a dull pain pulsing behind his eyes, and his body felt sluggish like he'd been drugged. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. The last thing he remembered was the raid, a black ops mission deep behind enemy lines. His team had been ambushed. He'd seen the flash of an energy blast, felt the shock wave knock the breath from his lungs. Then nothing. Now he was here, wherever here was. Jack pushed himself up, muscles protesting as he scanned his surroundings. A dense jungle stretched in every direction, its foliage thick and unfamiliar. Strange, bioluminescent vines coiled around ancient trees, their bark dark and slick like wet obsidian. The air was thick with humidity, making his combat fatigues cling to his skin. His gear was gone. No rifle, no sidearm, no comms. All he had were his instincts and the sharp edge of military training carved into his bones. A rustling sound snapped his attention to the right. He dropped into a crouch, senses sharpening. The underbrush shifted again, something moving just beyond his vision. He reached for a weapon that wasn't there. A body burst from the foliage. A man, disheveled and terrified, his face streaked with mud. His uniform was tattered, barely recognizable beneath the grime. Not human. Jack saw that instantly. The creature had deep-set black eyes, skin a mottled gray-blue, and ridges along his jawline. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling too fast. "Help me," the alien gasped. His voice was distorted, his accent thick but understandable. "They're coming." Jack didn't have time to ask who they were. A sharp whistle cut through the jungle, followed by the mechanical hum of something moving fast. The alien flinched. Jack grabbed his arm, yanking him down just as a bolt of red energy sliced through the air where his head had been a second ago. The blast struck a tree, igniting the bark in a burst of flame. A hunting party. Jack shoved the alien down. "Stay low," he ordered, scanning for cover. He spotted an outcropping of jagged rocks and sprinted toward it, dragging the alien behind him. They dove just as another energy bolt ripped past them. Jack pressed his back against the stone, breathing hard. A voice echoed through the trees, cold, clipped, and full of amusement. "Run, little prey. Make it interesting." Jack's jaw tightened. The voice was distinctly alien, but the message was all too human. This wasn't war. This was sport. The alien beside him was shaking. "They hunt us. For entertainment." Jack had suspected as much. The Galactic Empire, the oppressive force ruling half the known galaxy, was infamous for its brutality. But this was something else. A sadistic game where prisoners were released on an isolated world, hunted down like animals. The Empire's elite warriors, the Zelari, prided themselves on tracking and killing their prey. Jack's mind worked fast. If this was a game, then there were rules he could break. He peered around the rock. 3 figures emerged from the jungle, their tall, armored forms moving with lethal grace. Their weapons were sleek, curved rifles that pulsed with energy, their armor black with red sigils carved into the plating. Their faces were hidden behind visors, but Jack didn't need to see their eyes to know they were smiling. They thought this was a game. Jack decided to change the rules. He turned to the alien. "You want to live?" The alien nodded frantically. "Then follow my lead." Jack grabbed a loose rock and hurled it in the opposite direction. It crashed through the underbrush, drawing the hunter's attention. The moment their heads turned, Jack moved. He launched himself from cover, closing the distance in seconds. Before the closest hunter could react, Jack was on him, grabbing his rifle and wrenching it sideways. The weapon fired wildly, the blast catching one of the other hunters in the chest. The alien crumpled. Jack twisted the rifle free and swung it like a club, slamming the butt into the second hunter's visor. The glass cracked, and the alien staggered. Jack didn't give him time to recover. He drove a knee in his gut, then a vicious elbow to the throat. The hunter gurgled, dropping to his knees. Jack grabbed his fallen blade, a wicked, curved thing that hummed with energy, and buried it into the alien's neck. The last hunter was faster. He dodged back, raising his rifle. Jack had seconds. He threw himself sideways as the blast seared past his shoulder. Pain flared, but he ignored it. Rolling, he came up with the stolen rifle and fired. The shot hit home, punching through the alien's chest. The hunter collapsed, twitching once before going still. Silence. Jack exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. He turned to the alien he'd saved, who was staring at him like he was something unnatural. "You killed them." Jack wiped blood from his cheek. "Yeah, that's kind of my thing." He searched the bodies, stripping them of weapons and anything useful. A small device on one of their wrists caught his attention. He tapped the screen, and alien text scrolled across it. It took a moment, but he recognized enough of the symbols to understand. A map. A hunting ground. Jack's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just some backwater planet. It was a controlled environment, a testing ground for the Empire's elite. And he wasn't the only prey. "How many others?" he asked, showing the alien the screen. The alien swallowed. "Dozens. Maybe more. Some have been here for weeks." Jack glanced at the jungle. The Empire thought they were running a game. He was about to turn it into a war. He strapped the stolen rifle across his back and met the alien's gaze. "We're not running anymore." For the first time, he saw something shift in the alien's expression. Hope. Jack turned toward the jungle, already planning his next move. The hunt was over. Now, it was their turn to hunt. Jack moved through the jungle like a shadow, his every step deliberate, every movement calculated. The rifle he had stolen from the dead Zalari hunter felt unfamiliar in his hands. Its weight was lighter than any human-made firearm, its balance off. He would have preferred his own weapons, but he wasn't in a position to be picky. He adjusted his grip and kept moving, his senses tuned to every shift in the environment. Behind him, his reluctant companion, the alien he had saved, struggled to keep pace. Jack hadn't asked for his name yet. Names weren't important right now. Survival was. The alien, winded and jittery, was slowing him down, but Jack knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed information, and this one had already survived longer than most. That meant he knew things Jack didn't. The jungle canopy stretched thick overhead, filtering the light into dim, eerie patches that flickered as the wind moved the leaves. Strange creatures skittered in the underbrush, their eyes flashing in the darkness, but Jack ignored them. His focus was ahead, on the faint blue glow of an energy field flickering in the distance. He crouched low and signaled for the alien to do the same. "That's a supply drop," the alien whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "They send them in to make the hunt last longer. Just enough to keep some of us alive, so they can keep killing us." Jack's jaw tightened. The sadism of it was almost admirable in its efficiency. Keep the prey just strong enough to struggle, to make the chase worth watching. He scanned the area around the drop site, noting the open ground and the lack of cover. A perfect kill zone. They'd be watching. How many hunters left on the ground? Jack murmured. "At least a dozen, maybe more," the alien said. "And that's not counting the ones they'll send when they realize these 3 aren't coming back." Jack weighed his options. The smart move was to avoid the drop, find another way to get supplies. But he wasn't here to play smart. He was here to send a message. "Stay here," he ordered, handing the alien a stolen knife. "If I don't come back, you run. If you see something that doesn't belong to the jungle, you stab first." The alien hesitated, then nodded. Jack moved like a predator, sticking to the shadows as he approached the clearing. The supply crate sat in the center of a small, rocky plateau, humming faintly with power. He could see the faint shimmer of an energy shield around it, a precaution against scavengers. He crouched, eyes scanning the trees. They'd be here, watching, waiting for someone desperate enough to take the bait. He found a first one perched in the canopy, half hidden behind thick branches. The alien was good, still disciplined, patient, but Jack had spent years hunting men just like him. He moved silently beneath the tree and fired once. The shot punched clean through the hunter's visor. A body hit the ground with a dull thud. The second one wasn't as easy. A shimmer in the air, almost imperceptible, betrayed the presence of an active cloaking field. Jack let out a slow breath, forcing himself to relax. He closed his eyes for half a second, listening. The jungle spoke in 100 different voices, rustling leaves, distant chirps, the hum of insects, and then the faintest whisper of fabric brushing against bark. Jack pivoted and fired. The shot tore through the air, and the cloaking field failed in a burst of light. An armored Zelari staggered back, blue blood spraying from a wound in its side. It let out a guttural snarl and raised its weapon. Jack was faster. He closed the distance in 2 strides and drove his knife into its throat, twisting hard. The body went limp before it hit the ground. The third hunter made a mistake. He ran. The moment Jack heard footsteps retreating through the brush, he raised a rifle and put a shot through the fleeing alien's back. The corpse collapsed face first into the dirt. The jungle was silent again. Jack exhaled and moved toward the crate, pressing his palm against the shield. The field flickered, scanning his biometrics, then deactivated with a soft chime. He pried the lid open and took quick inventory. Rations, medkits, ammunition, though not for his stolen rifle. A communications device, locked. That would need time to crack. And at the bottom, a small explosive charge. Jack smiled. He took what he needed, then set the charge inside and armed it. He retreated back into the foliage, watching as the jungle reclaimed the silence. Then he waited. It didn't take long. A scout arrived first, cautious, scanning the area. Then 2 more. One of them approached the crate, tapped at the device. Jack squeezed the detonator. The explosion lit up the night, sending shrapnel and body parts in every direction. The blast wave shook the trees, scattering birds and beasts into the sky. Jack didn't waste time admiring his work. He was already moving, using the chaos to slip away. He found his companion right where he had left him, staring wide-eyed at the smoking remains of the supply drop. "They'll send more now," the alien said, voice tight with fear. Jack nodded. "Good." The alien looked at him, searching his face. "You're not just trying to survive, are you?" Jack checked the stolen rifle, making sure it was fully charged. He glanced at the jungle, the distant glow of the Empire's outpost barely visible beyond the trees. "I'm not here to play their game," he said. "I'm here to break it." The alien swallowed hard but nodded. Jack took a step forward toward the battle ahead. The jungle stretched before him, dark and full of death. He smiled. Let them come. The jungle burned. Plumes of black smoke twisted into the sky, and the stench of scorched flesh mixed with the acrid bite of ozone from discharged plasma rifles. Jack crouched behind a shattered boulder, his stolen rifle humming in his hands, its barrel still hot from the last exchange. Across the clearing, the corpses of 3 more Zelari hunters lay sprawled in the dirt, their armor cracked and their weapons cooling beside them. They had been better than the last group. Smarter, more coordinated. Jack had barely managed to take them down before they overwhelmed him, and that was a problem. The longer he survived, the more dangerous his pursuers became. The Empire had finally stopped underestimating him. He wiped sweat and blood from his brow and glanced at his companion. The alien, whose name he had learned was Corvin, was trembling, his hands clutched tightly around a stolen pistol. He wasn't a fighter, not really, but fear had hardened him into something close. "They're adapting," Corvin whispered. His voice carried just enough panic to remind Jack that he wasn't used to winning against the Zelari. "They're not sending standard hunters anymore." Jack nodded. He had noticed it too. The ones he had just killed weren't here for sport. They had moved with precision, their attacks calculated, their responses immediate. The Empire had stopped playing. A soft chime sounded in the distance, metallic, rhythmic. It was a sound Jack hadn't heard before, but it set his teeth on edge. Corvin stiffened. Void Reapers. Jack didn't ask for details. He could guess. Elite. Unrelenting. Probably enhanced. He adjusted the stolen rifle's grip, considering his options. He had been waging guerrilla war for days now, striking at supply drops, sabotaging patrols, planting false trails. He had turned the hunters into the hunted. But the Empire had finally decided to stop chasing him with amateurs. A faint blur moved through the smoke, low to the ground, fast. Jack barely had time to throw himself sideways before a blade swept through the space where his head had been a second earlier. He hit the ground and rolled, bringing the rifle up, but the enemy was already on him. The Void Reaper was taller than the others, its armor sleeker, almost organic, as if it molded to its movements rather than restricted them. It moved like a shadow, its knife a whisper of silver death. Jack blocked an incoming strike with the body of his rifle, the force of the impact sending a shock up his arms. The hunter twisted, striking low, and Jack barely managed to shift his weight in time to avoid the knife burying itself in his ribs. Jack let go of the rifle. It was slowing him down. He drove his knee into the alien's stomach, forcing space between them, then reached for his own stolen blade. The Void Reaper recovered instantly, lunging again, but Jack was ready this time. He sidestepped, caught the alien's wrist, and twisted. The knife clattered to the ground, and in the same motion, Jack drove his own blade up beneath the hunter's chin, piercing through soft flesh into the brain. The Void Reaper jerked once, then went still. Jack ripped the blade free and let the body collapse. Corvin was gasping behind him. There are more coming. Jack wiped the blood from his knife and retrieved his rifle. Then we keep moving. They ran. The jungle had become their battleground, but Jack knew they couldn't keep fighting like this. Attrition would kill them before the Empire did. He needed to change the terms of engagement. The outpost was his answer. He had seen the transmissions coming from the other side of the valley, their signals brief but frequent. The Zelari weren't just hunting, they were reporting back. If there was an outpost, then there were ships. If there were ships, then there was a way off this rock. They reached the edge of the tree line and crouched. Below, nestled in a clearing, was the facility. It was smaller than he expected, but that didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. Guard towers loomed over the perimeter, and he counted at least 2 automated turrets sweeping the area. A handful of Zelari soldiers moved in a disciplined patrol pattern, their rifles held at the ready. Corvin whispered, "That's a relay station. They send reports from here to the fleet." Jack studied the layout. He didn't have the explosives to take out the entire compound, but destruction wasn't the goal this time. Information was. If he could get inside, tap into their systems, he could learn what they were really up against. "We'll need a distraction," Jack said. Corvin swallowed hard. "And if they catch us, they won't." Jack moved before the doubt could settle in. He circled wide, keeping low, using the thick foliage for cover. The guards weren't relaxed, but they weren't expecting an attack here. The jungle was supposed to be their kill zone. They didn't think anyone would be insane enough to take the fight directly to them. He found his opportunity in the form of a supply vehicle parked just outside the perimeter. Its power core hummed softly, exposed. A weak point. He rigged a grenade from the supplies he had stolen, wedging it beneath the vehicle's plating. Then he and Corvin waited. Minutes passed. The wind shifted, carrying the distant scent of charred wood and death. The jungle had swallowed dozens of bodies by now, but Jack could still hear them moving, searching. The Empire wasn't giving up. The moment 2 guards passed the vehicle, Jack triggered the grenade. The explosion was sharp and violent, sending shrapnel and flames into the air. The guards were thrown like rag dolls, one of them landing in a twisted heap several meters away. Sirens wailed and shouts filled the air. Jack didn't waste time. He sprinted through the chaos, weaving between debris, his stolen rifle raised. A guard turned, saw him too late, and Jack put a round through his chest. Another rushed forward, barking orders in the Zelari tongue, but Jack caught him with a shot to the throat. The station was in sight. He hit the control panel at the door, forced an override, and shoved his way inside. The air was cold, sterile. He moved quickly, finding the central console. Corvin hesitated before following. "We need to go." Jack ignored him, accessing the system. He was no hacker, but military systems followed patterns. He pulled up the latest transmission logs, scanning for anything useful. And then he found it. Not just a report, not just a record of the hunt. A direct message. Asterisk deploying reinforcements. Extermination protocol authorized. Asterisk. Jack's stomach turned to stone. The Empire wasn't just hunting anymore. They were sending in something bigger. Corvin saw the screen and went pale. They're wiping the slate. Jack grabbed a data drive, downloading everything he could. A warning siren blared. The system had caught on. Security lockdown engaged. Jack turned and fired at the console, frying it. He shoved Corvin toward the exit. Move! They burst into the night, alarms screaming behind them. The jungle was no longer their battlefield. It was their only chance of escape. Jack didn't stop to look back. The war had just changed, and he wasn't sure if they were ready for what came next. The jungle pulsed with tension, the air thick with the scent of charred metal and blood. Jack ran, his breath steady despite the fire in his muscles. The stolen rifle was clutched in his hands, his mind already mapping out his next move. Corvin struggled to keep up, his feet unsteady, but fear propelled him forward. They both knew what was coming. The Empire wasn't hunting anymore. It was cleansing. Behind them, the outpost burned, its alarms still wailing. The stolen data drive pressed against Jack's chest, tucked into one of the many pockets of his torn and bloodied fatigues. It held the truth, the Empire's decision to escalate. No more games. No more sport. A full-scale sweep. The jungle was about to become a graveyard, and if they didn't act fast, they'd be buried with it. Jack didn't bother explaining the plan to Corvin. There wasn't time. The Empire had resources, numbers, and technology. He had instinct. That would have to be enough. The first sign of the dropped ships was the tremor in the air. A distant hum, low and predatory, growing louder with every second. Jack skidded to a stop at the edge of a ravine, his eyes locking onto the shadowy figures emerging from the treetops. Sleek, black ships descended, their hulls reflecting the fire below. He could already see the hatches opening, soldiers preparing to deploy. They weren't standard hunters. Their armor was heavier, their weapons larger. Shock troopers. Corvin let out a choke sound. We can't fight that. Jack scanned the terrain, his mind calculating distances, angles, probabilities. The Empire believed in overwhelming force. But force was predictable. He spotted what he needed, a ridge to their left, jagged and unstable. If they could reach it, they could use the terrain against their pursuers. He grabbed Corvin's arm. Move. They sprinted just as the first energy bolts streaked through the air, scorching the ground behind them. Jack wove between the trees, forcing his body to keep pace. His mind was clear, sharp. He had trained for this. Not against aliens, not in a jungle on some nameless planet, but it didn't matter. Combat was combat. The ridge loomed ahead. It was steep, covered in loose rock and thick vines. A natural bottleneck. He could use that. Jack reached it first, spinning around and raising his rifle. He took careful shots, not wasting a single round. A trooper dropped, then another. But there were too many. They moved as a unit, pushing forward with mechanical precision. Corvin scrambled up the ridge, barely keeping his footing. Jack didn't turn. He threw a stolen grenade, the explosion tearing through the nearest cluster of troops, buying them seconds. Then he moved, climbing fast, his fingers digging into rock and vine. Below, the soldiers adjusted, switching tactics. A deep, resonant hum filled the air. Jack didn't need to see the weapon to know what it was. A heavy plasma cannon. The first shot hit the ridge with a deafening crack, sending shards of stone flying. Jack ducked, shielding his face as debris sliced his skin. The second shot struck lower, shaking the entire cliffside. He felt the ground beneath him shift. It was collapsing. Jack lunged, grabbing Corvin by the back of his tunic and hurling them both forward as the ridge gave way. They hit the ground hard, rolling through the dirt. Behind them, the rock face crumbled, an avalanche of stone swallowing the path. Dust choked the air. Jack pushed himself up, ignoring the sting of fresh wounds. The ridge was gone. So were the soldiers beneath it. Corvin coughed, staring at the destruction. Did we? Jack didn't answer. He was already moving, his eyes fixed on the sky. The ships were still there. The Empire wasn't done. He pulled the data drive from his pocket and held it up. This gets off-world, we win. Corvin stared at him. Ow! Jack smirked. We steal a ship. Corvin blinked. Then, to Jack's surprise, he laughed. It was short, bitter, and edged with disbelief, but it was laughter nonetheless. Jack turned toward the burning horizon, toward the battle still waiting. He felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, the pulse of adrenaline in his veins. The Empire thought, They had already won. They were about to learn how wrong they were.